the screening was on December 7th. On December 6th, they were still mixing the final reel on the dub stage, with the final visual effects being dropped in literally on the dub stage. There was a guy from Dolby there, like literally ready to catch the reel off the thing, run to the lab, shoot the optical, take that reel and get on a plane and fly overnight to get to the theater. And the screening was already going in the theater, and the last reel wasn't in the theater yet. And he literally ran in and popped it on the projector and play. About 1979, through the oddest circumstances that would ever get you a career change, another friend of mine from Cleveland, a fellow named Pax Lemon, has now moved to Los Angeles, and he's working at Paramount Pictures.
And this is the roundabout way you ended up working in Star Trek, basically.
Exactly, and that's what got me to Star Trek. Was he was working in a transfer bay, just making copies of tapes, and these two sound effects editors, Richard Anderson and Stephen Flick, are having a conversation about how they needed somebody who knew about synthesizers for the movie. And he turns around and goes, "Oh man, you got to talk to my buddy Adam, man. Yeah, he works for Weather Report. He knows all about synthesizers." And they look at him like, "Weather Report, is that the one at 7 o'clock or 11 o'clock?" I mean, Weather Report, the Weather Report, not the band. But nonetheless, he explained, no, and they got it. Gave him my number. I went down and took a meeting with them, and found out they were doing Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Well, that's exciting. How do we get started here? He says, "Well, can you make an audition tape?" All right, so what would you like? I said, "Well, we got three little tests for you. One is to make the sound of the Starship Enterprise going from warp 1 to warp 7, which is a scene in the first movie where they have to do this big acceleration to get to where they need to go in a big hurry on an untested Star Trek. The Enterprise has just been rebuilt. It hasn't been shook out, but we're going to push the envelope." So my sound design thought was, well, you just can't go, it'll be over too fast. So I made sort of this undulating acceleration, and I dialed it all up on a Prophet 5 synthesizer, which actually, just as a side note, is this one down here.
Oh, is that the original one you used?
That's actually, it's been replaced since then, but it's that one, that synthesizer. And there's a section called the polymod, which modulates some tones together. So it's not just an oscillator, it's oscillators feeding oscillators feeding oscillators, and it gave this tonality, which I dialed up and said, Starship Enterprise. And I turned in that tape, and that sound effect that I made on the Prophet 5 synthesizer actually became one of the core elements of the sound of the Starship Enterprise.
So your test is what's basically what we're hearing in the final version.
Yeah. So like I hit a home run, not knowing what I was doing, and just boop, and it worked. So then I sort of earned the chair of being the guy who had the sound of the Enterprise, and that meant that I was on Star Trek 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the motion pictures as the go-to guy. That no matter what they were doing, you'd go to Alan and he would deal with the Starship Enterprise and sort of all the extra space hardware, the bridge sounds, the transporters, phasers, lasers, other devices, the space hardware. And the idea was this: you couldn't record this with a microphone. I mean, this didn't exist in reality. So much like all these things were optical effects, right? I mean, if you know what a visual effects is, like ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, they would make special effects visually. I became the person who added the sounds to those special visual effects. So I became a sound effects specialist. In fact, my credit in those early movies is special sound effects. So there was already supervising sound effects editors, Foley editors, ADR editors. So that somewhere to put me into a stack, I became a special sound effects creator. And at the time on that first Star Trek, it wasn't just me, it was myself. There was another fellow named Frank Serafini, and also Joel Goldsmith, who was Jerry Goldsmith's son, and a fellow named Dirk Dalton, because there's a whole story on that first Star Trek. You probably heard it before, but the visual effects list to be made originally went to a fellow named Robert Abel, who was a genius in his right, but it became clear early on that he didn't have the bandwidth to crank out all those effects on the timeline that they had. They had actually scheduled a screening on December 7th of that year for NASA. And no one was going to say, we can't make it. So they went to John Dykstra's, they went to Doug Trumbull's, they put all these effects houses on 24/7. I don't care what it costs, we got to have it emergency mode. So same with us as sound effects creators. A lot of stuff we didn't see it finished. We just saw bits and pieces. So the idea was, we'll figure it out when we get there. So there was like 3 sound effects creation teams, myself, Serafini, and the Goldsmith team, all making our own versions of whatever it was. And when we got to the dub stage, when we finally saw what it was, the mixers would then sort of make a mix out of whatever all the elements are. So it didn't give a broad palette of colors to make things out of. So that was sort of the way that one went down. It was pretty wild.
Yeah.
A short story on that. It was so crazy that the screening was on December 7th. On December 6th, they were still mixing the final reel on the dub stage, with the final visual effects being dropped in literally on the dub stage. And then that mag sound literally there was a guy from Dolby there, like literally ready to catch the reel off the thing, run to the lab, shoot the optical, take that reel and get on a plane and fly overnight to get to the theater. And the screening was already going in the theater, and the last reel wasn't in the theater yet. And he literally ran in and popped it on the projector and play. And it was down to like, it was a movie in itself to get the movie to screen that day. Also know that that first Star Trek was one of the first Dolby stereo films. And we were pioneering, because before that, movies were mono. So what was happening in the world of Dolby and THX and theater sound was being upgraded from mono to stereo to surround sound. So that was all enveloping around me providing special sound effect services. But then what else kept growing, and here we are with Dolby Atmos and 16, 20, 30, 60 speakers in the theater. And what can you do with that now? So I've taken the ride from the beginning to where we are today. So I think my experience level is, I would get expert when it comes to that, live the whole thing. So back to the sound design concepts is where we asked, what does this say? So certainly I listened to the transporter, the original transporter. That was a foundation. It's going to still sound like the transporter, but this was the new improved with Levin in stereo with more elements. So what you do in sound design is you're making sound effects from a stack of sound effects. So it's a little of this and a little of this and a little of this, like a layer cake. And then some mix and blend of those becomes the new sound. The other thing that was an eye opener for me was, again, a Mr. Synth and Mr. Tape recorders, but the sound effects editors were asking for organic sounds. It couldn't just be electronic, it had to be real. So the tape recorder art was something that I ramped up on really fast, because now we have digital samplers, but at the time, tape recorder was your real sounds. So I had an analog, called a TAC 8-track, half-inch 8-track tape recorder with some noise reduction on it. So it was a pretty good machine. And I had modified it for vary speed. So I had on a knob the speed of the tape deck. Rather than being fixed, I could go from 0 to 30 IPS in the speed of the tape recorder. So I could speed the deck up and down, and you could also put stuff on backwards and play with stuff backwards on the tape recorder. And that was your exploratory organic sound creation machine. And then I would then do stuff with that and record whatever happened there to another tape recorder on a fixed tape, so that got captured, whatever you did with tape art. So there was a lot to speeding up and slowing down and vary speeding, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, at one point I had the sound of the Enterprise on an 8-track, where I had the original Star Trek, original Prophet 5 audition sound, the sound, an air conditioner sound they called Room 13, which was like a kind of organic room sound. I would then vary the speed of the tape recorder for the acceleration and deceleration of the ship in 8 tracks. So then the 8 tracks would then go to the dub stage so they could fool around with the blending of those elements. But I was basically Sulu at the time, but as an audio designer. And so I would watch the movie and fly the ship on this tape recorder and then give to the sound effects editors a track that was the right length with the right up and downs. Because again, remember, they're just on a fixed machine, a moviola that it just plays whatever you put on it at a fixed speed. So all the manipulations had to be done before it got to the sound effects editors. So that was one of the roles I had, and I continued on with that. And then all the other space hardware, like the bridge background, or sometimes the telemetry lights are blinking and stuff like that. So the idea of making things that were synchronous to the image was what I grew into and learned how to do all that stuff.
So there's another pretty iconic sound also in that very first Star Trek the motion picture, and that would be the sound of V'ger. And I'd love to hear any stories about that, because that's just got such a unique sound quality to it.
Yeah, no, there was a really great challenge to try to create something original. In the last scene, when finally Ilea and the gang get to meet V'ger for the first time, and so there's this big approach to, before we see V'ger in this space with the lightning coming down, and we didn't want it to be lightning that we know. It wanted to be different, and so back to the studio, trying to figure out what can I do with this stuff. My setup at the time, I had a pedal steel guitar and a Moog vocoder. So I took the output of the Moog, of the pedal steel, fed it into the vocoder with white noise on one side. So there was like, so I had the full bandwidth of a sound. But then the exciter part was the pedal steel guitar, and I, with the pedal steel guitar, started literally with the steel bullet that you take a thing, and started banging and swiping up, doing that kind of stuff on the pedal steel through the vocoder. And it just made this amazing effect that became the V'ger lightning from stuff. And again, that it drops into the Paramount Lightning, and it's a favorite, and it's still here decades later being used for alternate electronic spark sound effects things. But it was just another rock and roll moment of coming up with something original, because what does that sound like? Make me that.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, just the journey from finding the sound effect to making it the final product. It's such a cool thing to do.
Yeah, and that's what I like. I mean, my personality is I love pioneering. I mean, once it's kind of all, the book is written and you know how to do it and there's a manual, I'm looking for the next thing. I'm done.
Thanks for watching Tales from Trek Untold. Check out the full interview with this guest or other episodes from Trek Untold here on our channel or wherever you get podcasts. Subscribe now at warp speed, but not fast enough to turn you into a salamander.